I think it's about time Canada government need to focus on what are the beneficial for Canada. It's Arctic. That one particular area. This particular project is the one that could shovel ready in 2026.
This is really a catalytic moment for Canada and for our government, and I say that because we've got a Prime Minister who has brought the importance of the Arctic and sovereignty that is not recognized by countries like Russia and our friends, the United States.
Control is a difference between a line on a map and real power. And that idea now sits at the center of Canada's Arctic strategy. When Mark Carney delivered his blunt message after Ottawa committed $7 billion to new Arctic icebreakers, there was no soft language and no diplomatic cushioning. The point was unmistakable. If Canada is building the ships, servicing the ports, and enforcing the rules, then Canada decides what happens in those waters. For decades, that was not how things worked. American vessels moved through the Northwest Passage for nearly 70 years without asking permission. U.S. submarines surfaced at the North Pole and treated the region as international space. Ottawa objected, but without infrastructure or enforcement, those objections carried little weight. That balance began to shift as pressure from Washington intensified. Donald Trump's tariffs and rhetoric about economic dominance reshaped Canadian politics and helped push Carney into power with a mandate to push back. At the same time, the Arctic itself was changing faster than policy could keep up. Melting ice transformed a once impractical route into a viable corridor, valued at roughly $900 billion over the coming decades. Russia and China noticed. So did Canada. Instead of backing down, Ottawa looked north and decided to act. The question now is whether this moment marks the point when Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic stops being theoretical and starts being enforced. Geography explains why the dispute exists at all, but geography alone never decides who wins it. The Northwest Passage is not a single, clean channel across the top of the continent. It is a complex web of narrow straits, bays, and sea lanes threading through Canada's Arctic archipelago, linking the Atlantic and Pacific in a way that looks simple on a map but brutal in reality. For centuries, this route was sealed by ice so thick and unpredictable that entire expeditions vanished trying to cross it. Wooden ships were crushed. Steel hulls were trapped for years. Even modern vessels treated the passage as a gamble with no margin for error. It carried enormous theoretical value because it shortened global trade routes, yet for most of history it remained useless in practice. Nature enforced the rules, and nature did not care about economics or geopolitics. That natural barrier is collapsing. The Arctic is warming faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. Ice that once locked the passage for 10 months of the year now retreats earlier and returns later, opening navigable windows that continue to expand. Climate models and shipping forecasts increasingly align. By the mid-2030s, many experts expect the Northwest Passage to be largely ice-free during summer months. By mid-century, with icebreaker support, year-round navigation becomes plausible rather than speculative. This shift changes the math for global trade in a way that is difficult to overstate, that a container ship sailing from Shanghai to New York through the Northwest Passage cuts more than 6,000 kilometers compared to the Panama Canal route. That distance translates into days saved at sea, lower fuel consumption, reduced crew costs, and faster delivery for high-value and time-sensitive cargo. In an industry where margins are thin and schedules matter, those advantages reshape decisions at the highest levels. Projections already estimate that by 2050, between 2 and 5% of global maritime shipping could pass through the passage. On its face, that may sound modest until it is placed next to the scale of global trade itself. Maritime commerce moves roughly $20 trillion in goods each year. 2% of that equals $400 billion. 5% pushes a figure toward $1 trillion. Shipping tolls, however, are only part of the story. The deeper value lies beneath the water and across the frozen land surrounding it. Canada's Arctic contains vast deposits of critical minerals, including rare earth elements, nickel, copper, lithium, zinc, and gold. These materials are essential for electric vehicles, advanced weapon systems, and renewable energy technology. For decades, these resources sat beyond reach, not because they were unknown, but because moving them to market was prohibitively expensive. There were no roads, no rail links, and no ports capable of handling large-scale exports. Airlifted materials was the only option, limiting viable mining to the most valuable commodities. The opening of the Northwest Passage transforms that equation. Ports, icebreaker support, and reliable shipping lanes turn once isolated mineral deposits into commercially viable assets. Canada becomes not just a transit route, but a gateway to resources the global economy increasingly depends on. Control over access to the passage becomes control over the flow of those materials. That is where the $900 billion figure comes from. It reflects the combined value of trade, extraction, infrastructure, and strategic leverage projected over the next 3 decades. The center of this transformation, set a sovereignty dispute that has simmered for nearly 80 years. Canada has claimed the Northwest Passage as internal waters since 1946. The legal reasoning is straightforward under Canadian law. The waterways run through Canadian territory, weaving between islands that are unquestionably Canadian. Under this view, vessels crossing the passage should require Canadian permission, just as ships entering the St. Lawrence River or navigating the Great Lakes do. The United States has consistently rejected that position. Washington argues that the Northwest Passage qualifies as an international strait under maritime law, granting all vessels a right of transit passage without seeking permission. Canada may set environmental and safety standards, but cannot deny access. For decades, this disagreement remained manageable because the passage itself had limited practical value. As long as ice made transit rare, the legal debate stayed largely academic. The deeper problem for Canada was not legal theory, but enforcement. Without icebreakers, port surveillance, or a sustained presence, Ottawa could not meaningfully assert control. What is changing now is not just climate, but the willingness to invest in the tools that turn claims into power. When sovereignty stops being theoretical, assumptions change, and the Arctic shifts from a blank space on a map into a contested frontier where decisions carry real consequences. Sovereignty means little without the ability to exercise it, and for decades Canada lacked the infrastructure and military presence needed to control the Arctic in any meaningful way. The Canadian Armed Forces conducted limited annual exercises in the region. A small number of Rangers patrolled immense distances with minimal logistical support. Coast Guard vessels operated only during brief summer windows. There were no deep water ports capable of servicing large ships, no permanent military bases positioned for sustained operations, and no comprehensive surveillance network to track traffic moving through the Northwest Passage. Monitoring vessels was difficult. Stopping them was nearly impossible in that environment. Other powers behaved accordingly. The United States treated the passage as open water and operated as if Canadian consent was unnecessary. Russia moved in the opposite direction, investing heavily in Arctic infrastructure, building a fleet of roughly 50 icebreakers, and establishing military bases along its northern coastline. China entered the picture more subtly, labeling itself a near-Arctic state and sending research and survey vessels through the region. Canada objected diplomatically, but without the tools to back those objections, its position faded into the background of larger geopolitical calculations. The shift began when Ottawa accepted that symbolism was no longer enough. Churchill was only the starting point. The broader Arctic Infrastructure Fund targeted northern airports, all-weather roads linking remote communities and mining sites, expanded Coast Guard operations, new radar and surveillance systems, and military facilities capable of supporting year-round deployments. The most consequential commitment was $7 billion for 2 new heavy icebreakers. These were not ceremonial assets. They were polar-class vessels designed to break through 3 meters of ice and operate in temperatures approaching minus 50 degrees Celsius. Their purpose was simple and direct. Establish a permanent Canadian presence in Arctic waters, regardless of season or conditions. The timeline reflected urgency rather than caution. The first icebreaker is scheduled for delivery by 2030, the second by 2032. Port upgrades at Churchill began immediately. Infrastructure to support critical mineral exports is expected to be operational within 5 years. This pace signaled a fundamental shift in strategy. Infrastructure creates facts on the ground, or in this case, on the water. For decades, the United States treated the Northwest Passage as international waters because Canada lacked the capacity to manage it. No ports meant no leverage over shipping. No icebreakers meant limited monitoring. No sustained military presence meant regulations could not be enforced. As those conditions change, the legal debate becomes less decisive. Continuous icebreaker patrols allow Canada to require ships to report their movements, except Canadian pilots, and comply with environmental and safety rules. Functioning ports give vessels practical incentives to cooperate, from refueling and repairs to emergency assistance in one of the world's most dangerous operating environments. Control exercised daily outweighs arguments made in courtrooms. Over time, behavior adapts to reality rather than theory. This shift carries consequences far beyond Canada and the United States. China and Russia are watching closely. If Washington continues to argue that the Northwest Passage is an international strait, that logic applies equally to all nations. Chinese and Russian vessels gain the same right to transit claimed by American ships. That outcome undercuts North American security at a foundational level. NORAD exists to defend the continent from threats approaching over the Arctic. Unrestricted access to Arctic waters near North America weakens that defensive perimeter. Some American strategists have begun to acknowledge this contradiction privately, questioning whether supporting Canadian sovereignty might better serve long-term security interests. Such a recalibration would require admitting decades of error and accepting that Canada controls access to a corridor valued at roughly $900 billion. That shift has not yet occurred, and time is not on Washington's side. The greatest irony is how American pressure helped reshape the strategic landscape. Russia has spent decades preparing for an Arctic future, building icebreakers, bases, and shipping routes designed to move up to 100 million tons of cargo annually through its Northern Sea route by 2030. China, despite its distance from the Arctic Circle, has invested heavily in icebreaker technology, scientific missions, seabed mapping, and diplomatic ties with Arctic states. For years, Canada and the United States worked together to counter that expansion. Trade, conflicts,